When we play music, we have to define a style through a cultivated knowledge of the ingredients of this style, not only technically, instrumentally, acoustically, the quality of the defining articulation of a specific resonance, in a way the defining of what is tension, release, consonance, dissonance, and length of concentration for the phrasing. How do you carry further than the intuitive harmonic progression that coats the melodic line, especially if it's polyphonic? Or even if it is post-tonal and it's tonal-centered, or with some other system that comes towards the patterns, which define ways you organize your thoughts in the music itself as a narrative or atmospheric or mood setting, or just psychologically manipulative music through intervals, or, as I said, consonances or dissonances, not necessarily as, well, perhaps rather necessarily depending of the time periods in which these were what they were, representing the consonants, the resonance of the dissonance, how the obertones organize through the octave and the fifth or the 12th, and then the major third, the vibrations of the resonance that bring sounds to complete with each other in agreement, which what chord is about, like accord in French, d'accord, to be in agreement. And therefore, to organize the disagreements of the dissonances, either with delays to their resonances towards the resolutions, therefore their consonances in the classical, romantic, late romantic, early modern times, until then different languages redefined these aspects of what was more codified for at least from Renaissance onwards. Though even so, the Romantic era defined more the harmonization for the Romantic minor mode, whenever in the Renaissance and even before, but towards Baroque you have a lot of ascending minor with more top major tetrachord, and then bottom minor tetrachord. So you only had half minor for the third, not for the sixth, which defined the minor or the major. Then the leading tone being close to the tonic creates the gap for the harmonic, and therefore the whole idea of the evolution, or to a certain extent probably freezing of the evolution of the harmonic progression of the hierarchies of the subdominant as the fifth under the tonic, rather than the step under the dominant in the scale of the two tetrachords, rather than the circle of fifths, where in the perfect 7/5 the subdominant is on the left side and the dominant on the right side of the tonic, a fifth apart. So you can visualize this music theory-wise, the balance of the two elements, but in the scale, then subdominant is called so because it's step under the dominant, but it's not sub, it's just under. But it can have connotation that is not equal, like a plagal cadence 4/1 is weaker than 5/1 because it doesn't have the leading tone, or the tritone if you have the dominant seventh with the, anyway. I'm sure all of you who hear this know those things, but the fact is that this crystallization of the harmonic progressions as a coating of the melodic lines or the polyphonic lines are always different ways to approach the material, the texture even of the text in horizontal layers or in harmonic slices. Both are there. And to a certain extent, when you perform them on a single polyphonic instrument like the piano, and you have two voices in one hand and two voices in the other with stems up and down in the notation, at some point they combine, unless you're very attentive to make sure that the long values that decay, not musically because the tension of the suspension delay release remains tense musical terms wise, but not in acoustic terms, and you have to take that in account so that the passing tones or the other voice playing moving parts then is not overtaking the attention, since the attention is always where the action is, and therefore the idle voice inactive with a decaying instrument as a piano is tends to have the polyphony in a single hand combined according to the moving parts. And to a certain extent, that could be in the ambiguity that is left by the composer if they didn't spread it among two hands on several octaves distance where they don't combine because of the range. Such things have to be decided, like, do I play always the entrance of the fugue as if it's highlighted every time it comes up for the subject or the answer to be heard? Yes, but not necessarily only, because the beauty of the contrast subject is as meaningful. But if everything is on the same level of intensity, then you lose the attention how to follow this conversation among equals that polyphony truly is. So you have to make choices, you operate choices about which one you highlight, which one you play in the shadows, and how the chiaroscuro becomes, besides the contrast of the articulations, which is less obvious on the modern piano than on the fortepiano or the harpsichord, which was one of their major means of expression or delaying a note appropriately, tastefully, rubato-like, which with a tenuto accent or possibly a sforzando you can do on the modern piano without leaving the pulse, or then the fragmentation of the orchestral writing imitated on the piano, suggested by the textures in Beethoven sonatas, string quartet, aria, symphony, or woodwinds, or brass. And so when a student has to navigate through the texture and then through the stylistic knowledge of what represents what for when, like a mezzo forte in Schubert is not a mezzo forte in Franck, but why? Is it also because of the awareness of their musical language, or the way they amended the tonal system that was common to all to create some specific recognizable way that defines them? They didn't do it purposely, perhaps it just appeared so. But nevertheless, they are defined to us by some of their choices in question, like how they modulate. Do they modulate immediately, or do they take distances, or do they travel through a circle of fifths like Bach did? I enumerate many different ways of defining the aesthetics of the stylistic boundaries or frames, and how the composers don't fit in all those frames, because the Baroque composers overlap in the classical and the romantic in the modern, and late Brahms, early Debussy, written at the same time, are two different worlds that coincidentally were composed at the same time in the late 1890s. And what does it mean? It doesn't mean that one is more progressive, the other one is more conservative. On paper, yes, but in fact, it corresponds to their musical universe, their inner world of experiencing what they want to express, and what tools they use to be expressing that stylistically. And when we play them, we have to enter in the understanding that we play them for what they are in their work and how what their work represents for itself, rather than only placing it in a chronology of historic progression of the stylistic motion, because in that case we have this problem of placing Schubert with the Romantics or with the Classics because he died so young, and Beethoven already opened the gates to Romanticism, which was less formal and more expressive. But that doesn't mean that it defines only in the opposite way Haydn and J.C. Bach and early Mozart, because in their own ways they also explored individually beyond the boundaries of what they received if they felt they had to express it through that. In terms of their choices, in terms of our choices, how to translate them in the today's listeners' ears through today's instruments, which are not theirs, etc. But because people play a lot of music according to the way it used to be played, from treatises and reconstructed instruments, it's a parallel path to the one where people play, let's say, on the modern piano, the ancient music. And I don't speak of transcriptions per se, which is also one option, but the pieces written for the instrument as it evolved to be today, the middle pedal, the length of sound, the cross strings of the modern piano that gives more resonance to the medium and the bottom, when it was in the bottom range weaker, which didn't necessarily oblige the composers to write octaves in the left hand, but they did. And not in the right hand, like Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, of the straight-strung pianos. And I don't say that necessity make aesthetics, because after all it could be for a balance that they try to recreate with the depth of basses they were missing, which today with the cross-strung pianos overwhelm, unless then willingly you play them weaker or voiced with one of the two notes more brought out, so that you shape it as a sculptor, the text, so that you can get the balance between the ranges, which are more coherent in the cross-strung piano because they resonate by sympathy, most of the strings which are not played. And the same can be thought about the ornamentation in the Baroque. Was it only because of length of sound? Obviously not. It was because of the rhetoric. It was because of the expression, of the quality of the emotion through the voice or the bowed instruments on the keyboard as accompaniment of them on the harpsichord, or the instrument on its own doing it all. And the dances and the singing of the arias and of the Baroque dances on the harpsichord. And so then it becomes an analogy that you put in allegory of a minuet that is not dense, but it's suggested because of the choreography of it. And then you have the second and third beat a little heavier than the first, the short long. But that doesn't mean it's an accent per se. It can be a delay, it can be an ornament that is placed on a specific note, a note of every second beat either on, rather. And so I don't think that the ornaments were placed for necessity, nor the octaves in the left hand for the early fortepianos for necessity. I think there were in part that, but I think they evolved as their own aesthetics. So how do we translate that today? Their intent compared to their... The school of thought is to play what they wrote no matter on what. And that's true. That's the true respect of the text. But if you take the text outside of the context and you play it on an instrument where you realize that the balances of the ranges are no more the same according to the system of the resonance of the instrument, then same thing goes with pedaling. It gets blurry if you keep it as long as they suggest, because theirs didn't hold as long. So we could always retrofit and say, if they were here alive, they would say, okay, but no, we can't guess and second guess. Or then we should play all the instruments of their time. So when we translate it, we have to make an intelligent um, translation of their intention of how they imagine the soundscape for their piece. Beyond the instrument, to a certain extent, for the music itself, the essence of it, the intervals, the delayed resolutions, the suspensions, appoggiaturas, all the affects, the ornaments, or the alternatives if they were improvised, and what is structural and what is interchangeable or was interchangeable. Today it's no more because it's the editions froze it. Like we play the fermatas in Haydn's sonatas by waiting, when in Haydn's time it was expected to make a cadenza. So yes, scholars will convince you, and it's convincing. But if it's not taught and is not expected among performers in schools for performing through competitions, then you cannot do that openly, disadvantaging students by convincing them in improvising the cadenzas on fermata chords in Haydn sonatas when others won't, and because the publishers didn't. Therefore, this tradition, no matter how justified by the fact that it used to be, the tradition is no more. It doesn't mean that we should be provocative or just do it because of some kind of desire to be exotic for the sake of it, let's put it this way. I think it should be all about the meaning of the flow of the elements. I like to think a sonata form has an organization of the thoughts with contrasting more or less themes, with a development more or less developed, and a recapitulation where you have an osmosis reached by the tonalization of the second theme. Okay, this is on paper, but in reality, it's the transitions that define how you manage your merge in traffic when you go from one section to another. And the details that create the way you bring the flow of things to be natural, at least to seem to be logically following each other's thoughts. And I find that is as important as the frame, thematic materials, as well as managing the quality of the transitions. I think they define much more, or rather highlight and valorize the thematic materials of the wonderful theme which we hear, but it's the way the composer brings it in, modulation or a transition of more or less small or long length, or the composer chooses purposely not to, just all of a sudden I'm there, like Beethoven likes to provoke. And I think that is part of their personality. Schubert provoked less or differently. Sturm und Drang in harmonic modulations. It was fascinating him, and when we play it, we understand it. So do we overwhelm it because we involve ourselves in colorizing it with dynamic ranges? Possibly. But is it too much? I don't think so. I think we should leave everybody to have their own way of expressing what it means to them. It doesn't mean to be tolerant to anything. It's to be open to alterity, open-minded rather to alterity, and not with age get frozen in one's conservative knowledge, know-how. Perhaps both are healthy, to have strong, structured fundamentals of what you believe are the things which you transmit to your students, from which they can break those frames ultimately, but it gives them a frame with which they give them a discipline, and then you try to give them the taste of what a style defines Bach compared to Haydn, and even if they're close in time, they're already very different in time in terms of the evolution or the changes in the expression. An old Chopin would have been very different possibly, but we won't know. And then because they overlap with some composers who lived very long, then all of a sudden we have these situations where the one appear innovators, the other ones not, but in fact, individually they are to be served for what they are. They are timeless on their own for the message they create to bring either to the performer's pleasure of playing or challenge pleasure or challenge without pleasure sometimes. And then the listeners who discover or compare and contrast with other performers of what they grew up to like in the style, and they define it differently compared to the performer. And okay, they can dislike, a reviewer can write a bad review or disagreeing review or whatever, but that it's part of the fact that science is not a solid science. This is subjective points of view of how you craft your knowledge into which historic events and comparable to paintings and literature and sculpture and geography and industry and how things evolved in terms of the instrumentarium, and to put all this in the knowledge of how you shape your understanding or definition, even if it doesn't have to have rigid walls, as I said, of what it is to play a certain composer within a certain time frame of his or her time and on a modern instrument for people of today. It's an equation that the teacher is in a hyphen position between the dead composer and the young student who rediscovers the piece on their own, discovers, and you're next to them advising them in. And so it's fascinating how the same piece is never too much. In fact, probably what a true masterpiece is a piece that keeps on giving you capacity to discover layers in it you never saw before, after having carefully studied it for decades and going back to it, either to play or teach or perform or record or, I don't know, write about. That keeps us humble in front of all these elements that we have to take in account and then make a choice during the performance, either intuition, either acquired, but half-half is not bad, or perhaps different balance of the mix of the two. But ultimately, I think we are curious because we are intrigued, and then the intrigued, it comes through the ear for a musician, not necessarily only through the mind and the brain, when therefore the reflection, when you observe how it's written and you start marveling how with what limited, purposefully or so limited amount of thematic materials, economy of materials, that develop so many thoughts. Theme and variations, typical example for learning to discover how much you can say with what you have restricted yourself with in terms of material. Which doesn't mean that a composer who just throws melodies without developing them, like Debussy, is not, for instance, a composer to admire, even if you admire more the development of a thematic material of few notes by Beethoven, who is so creative with that, more than Mozart, who didn't deal so much with the development of the sonata form as Beethoven did, for instance. Not that comparison is any reason, but we tend to compare, since we play different styles more than in the past. They played styles of their pasts, in plural. So we have inevitably a moment or two of comparison. How they express themselves, how the brevity of a movement, like sonata had to be in 4 movements, became in 2, in 1. Anything can be a sonata, no more the form. But that didn't happen overnight. And regardless, Chopin never wrote one, at least not at the time when he died, obviously. Till he died, he wrote sonatas for piano in so many movements as the plan says in the book. That doesn't make them less striking than if he had then composers who write a cyclical form, single movement like Liszt, the sonata. That's why it's beautiful in art that is subjective, so it doesn't replace it like an objective hard science. This is a subjective opinion. So you accumulate different time periods and you appreciate them individually for what they are, and you serve them at your best, and you mix them in a program between centuries, a little of this, if you do a recital program, a little of that. But if you do, you have to do it, I believe, and that's what I'm trying to bring to my students, with a deep awareness of what you want to bring in this text beyond the notes themselves, syllabically so, but the expression of it, meaning what it conveys to us, beyond what it conveyed to people before us and what it will convey to people after us. That's the beauty of it, probably, that it keeps on giving. Thank you.